بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد. Today we'll be discussing the last part of Kitab al-Zakat, which is Babu Sadaqat al-Fitr. That is about Sadaqat al-Fitr. Now, first of all, we'll be discussing uh, the mabadi of this bab, i.e. the basics. And that includes Shara'it al-Wujub, things that make Sadaqat al-Fitr wajib. صدقة الفطر واجبة على الحر المسلم إذا كان مالكا لمقدار النساب. صدقة الفطر, it becomes wajib on every free Muslim, right? With the condition that they are the owner of the amount of the nisab that we have discussed in Kitab al-Zakat, whichever nisab it may be, whether it may be of gold and silver, of trade stocks, of animals, of crops, whatever it is. If that person reaches nisab, فاصلا عن مسكنه وثيابه وأثاثه وفرسه وسلاحه وعبيده للخدمة, with the condition that this excess wealth is other than that which is for his daily needs. So his residence is excluded, his clothes, his assets, his horses and other vehicles that he uses, his weapons or tools of trades, and his slaves, those he's kept for his own service and not for sale. So basically any item which is not for the purpose of selling, right? We know it's wajib because there's a hadith mentioned in Abu Dawud in which the Prophet Islam mentioned أدوا عن كل حر وعبد صغير أو كبير نصف صاع من بر أو صاع من شعير, that perform or pay Sadaqat al-Fitr on behalf of every free and bonded person, whether that bonded person is young or whether they are an adult. And how much do you have to pay? Nisfa sa'im min bur, you either give half a saw of wheat or one saw of barley, right? And the reason why it is wajib on a free person and not a slave is because you have to be an owner of a certain amount of wealth. And ownership can only happen in the case that a person is free, right? Because slaves don't own anything. The other is that Sadaqatul Fitr only becomes wajib on a Muslim because this is an act of ibadah, and ibadah can only be performed by someone who has accepted Islam. And one of the other conditions was al-yasar, having a moderate amount of wealth, which is the nisab. Because as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, La sadaqata illa an dhahri ghinan, that there is no sadaqah, a sadaqatul fitr, except for a rich person. And basically, if you have the nisab, you are rich in Islam. And it should be excess of the things that Sahib al-Kitab mentions, because all of the things are involved in the person's need, and you can't actually pay or force someone to pay zakat on that. Now, one of the things that is different between the nisab of zakat and sadaqat al-fitr uh, is the condition of numuf. Like we know that zakat only becomes wajib when you own a certain amount of wealth, which has the ability to grow, right? So take currency, for example. It grows without you doing anything. Or trade stock, for example, it has the potential to grow. But there are things that don't have the potential to grow. Like you have a lot of clothes which you don't use, but you don't intend on selling them either, so not for trade. So maybe they're just packed somewhere in your basement or your attic for years on end, no use to them. You don't know what's going to happen to them. That is excess wealth, but it doesn't have the potential to grow as such, right? So there will be sadaqatul fitr on that as well. What basically we're trying to say is we discussed two types of nisab. One is a nisab in which you have to pay zakat. The other is a nisab in which you don't have to pay zakat, but neither can you accept zakat. Sadaqatul fitr becomes wajib on this second kind of nisab, in which you can no longer receive zakat, but you wouldn't have to necessarily pay zakat. So those were the initial uh, points. Now let's talk about the hukum or the maqasid of the bab. So first question is, who is going to pay Sadaqatul Fitr on whose behalf Sadaqatul Fitr must be paid? That's the first question. And the second question is, on whose behalf a person does not have to pay Sadaqatul Fitr, right? يخرج ذلك عن نفسه وأولاده الصغار وعبيده للخدمة. So a person is going to have to pay Sadaqatul Fitr, first of all, on his own behalf, if he has wealth. Because of a hadith mentioned in Bukhari and Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ, Ibn Umar, he actually says, فرض رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم زكاة الفطر على الذكر والأنثى. That the Prophet ﷺ has made Sadaqat al-Fitr wajibun on every male and female. So we are primarily locus of obligation, so we have to pay on our behalf first. Then comes يخرج عن أولاده الصغار. A person has to pay Sadaqat al-Fitr on behalf of their small children, their non-adult children. Why? Because the sabab or the illah, the underlying cause behind Sadaqat al-Fitr, is رأس يمونه ويلي عليه. This is what the ibara that the fuqaha use. A Sadaqat al-Fitr is becoming wajib on a person, رأس يمونه ويلي عليه, a person that is under your care, basically, a person who you are in charge of feeding. So this would include automatically your younger children because that's the responsibility of the parents. Like if you're married, it would be the responsibility of the father, not the mother. But if you end up being a single mom, for example, the case that the father is actually dead and not just divorced, then the responsibility would shift to the mother if she is the breadwinner of the house. So obviously small children because you have responsibility for them. Secondly, slaves that you might own. So you need to have to pay on their behalf as well because again, being their owner, it is your responsibility to feed them, right? And so you have to give sadaqatul fitr on their behalf as well. Right. As far as the children are concerned, you only have to pay Sadaqatul Fitr on their behalf if they don't have any wealth. If they do have wealth, then you have to give zakat from their wealth, according to Abu Hanifa wa Abu Yusuf rahimahullah ta'ala. Right? So, for example, the father dies and he leaves behind his child with wealth, or the grandparents, and they leave something behind. So the child has enough, which would reach nisab, And so you don't have to give Sadaqat al-Fitr on his behalf anymore. You can take it from his own wealth. وَلَا يُؤَدِّي عَنْ زَوْجَتِهِ. A person is not going to pay Sadaqat al-Fitr on behalf of their wife. لقصور الولاية والمؤنة. Right? Because over there, he doesn't have like complete control, complete wilaya, nor is he responsible for every single expense of the wife. I mean, yes, he is responsible for the حقوق nikah, things that become wajib due to nikah, uh, the nafaqah and the sukna. But other than that, that's not his responsibility. ولا عن أولاده الكبار وإن كانوا في عياله. And neither is a person responsible for paying Sadaqat al-Fitr on behalf of his adult children, uh, even though they may be living with them because, they're not settled, they're not well off. They may be poor, but it won't be responsibility of the father or the parent, for the very reason that they don't have any wilaya over them. Once a child becomes an adult, a parent loses mostly all the control they have over them. So they're no longer responsible for the child. If they do, I mean, if they're taking care of them, obviously, there's a lot of ajr in it, but they're no longer responsible. ولو أدى عنهم أو عن زوجته بغير أمرهم. But if a person ends up paying on behalf of their wife or their children, grown-up children, uh, even though they didn't ask uh, the person to do so, it is permissible. It is still permissible because normally what happens is that the man of the house actually does pay Sadaqah al-Fitr on behalf of everybody, and everybody's okay with it until or unless the wife explicitly tells her husband not to pay on her behalf, or one of the grown-up children tell their father or anyone else for that regard not to pay on their behalf. That is another story, but usually a permission is granted in these cases. And so even if they don't ask, they don't uh, give permission, you can still pay on someone else's behalf. ولا يخرج عن مقاطبه ولا عن مماليكه للتجارة. Similarly, a person is not going to pay on behalf of his muqatab. And as you know, a muqatab is a slave who has made a contract with his master that if I get you X, Y, and Z amount of money, you will set me free. Now, this slave is not a complete slave, because he can make his own life choices now. Because if you make a contract with a slave like this, he's no longer bound to you, which means he has some freedom. And because he has this freedom and he's no longer completely bound to you, you're not responsible for him. And when you're not responsible for him, you won't have to pay his sadaqat al-fitr. Similarly, the muqaddam himself is not going to pay sadaqat al-fitr either, because obviously he owns nothing. Everything he's earning belongs to his master, so he is a faqir. Being destitute, there is no sadaqat al-fitr on him. وَلَا عَنْ مَمَالِكِهِ لِلتِّجَارَةِ. Also, all of the slave that a person owns for the sake of trade, business, there's no sadaqah al-fitr on it as well, because this being trade stocks, there will be zakat on it. And we know la thaniya fi zakat, that there is no doubling in zakat. You only have to give sadaqah, wajib sadaqah once. So if you're giving zakat on it, there's no sadaqah al-fitr. And those slaves which are not malut tijara, because you don't pay zakat on it, you don't have to pay sadaqatul fitr on it. وَالْعَبْدُ بَيْنَ الشَّرِيكَيْنِ. And if two people together own a slave, Neither one of them has to pay Sadaqah al-Fitr on behalf of that slave. Why? Because neither one of them owns it completely or has complete responsibility over it. ويؤدي المسلم الفطرة عن عبده الكافر. And when we talk about a Muslim giving Sadaqah al-Fitr on behalf of their slaves, it doesn't really matter if the slave is a Muslim or non-Muslim, because the hadith is actually uh, doesn't have that condition. The hadith just says to give out Sadaqat al-Fitr on behalf of your slaves, and that's it. It doesn't mention that the slave has to be Muslim or non-Muslim. It could be either, right? And on the other hand, there's a hadith of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, in which he explicitly mentions أي أدوا عن كل حر وعبد يهودي أو نصراني أو مجوسي, that give zakat on behalf of every free person and every slave, whether that slave is a Jew, it's a Christian, or it's a Magian. Because, like we mentioned, the underlying cause is still present, right? And so you'd have to give fitra on that behalf. Now, the second important part of this topic is to know about the miqdar and the waqt. Like, how much do you have to pay and when do you have to pay? Right? So, الفطرة نصف صاع من بر أو صاع من تمر أو زبيب أو شعير. The amount of fitra is 1.5 sa' of wheat or a complete sa' of either dates, raisins, or barley. Now, again, the question, what is a sa'? How do we understand it today, right? Well, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala, and Imam Muhammad, a sa' equals to 8 artal, right? And 8 Iraqi riddles. While Abu Yusuf rahimahullah ta'ala says that it is equal to 5 and 1/3 of a riddle, right? No need to get tangled up in what that means. Simply, half a sa of wheat equals to 1.6 kilograms of wheat, and one sa would, of either dates, barley, or raisins, that equals to 3.2 kilograms. So you have 1.6 kilograms, that's half a sa, double it, and that's 3.2 kilograms, right? So that is the amount that a person must pay uh, in Sadaqat al-Fitr for each single person that is responsible for paying. If she's only paying on her half, then either 1.5, 1.6, or 3.2 kilograms of whatever she's choosing to pay. And if it's two people, then double that amount, three, triple it, and so on. So that was the amount. What is the time? ووجوب الفطرة يتعلق بطلوع الفجر الثاني من يوم الفطر. The obligation of Fitra is connected to the second dawn on the day of Fitr and the first day of Eid, the first of Shawwal, when the sun comes up for Fajr. That is when Fitr becomes wajib. So if a person, they pass away after Maghrib or Isha, when Ramadan ends, but it's no longer Fajr yet, there's no Sadaqat al-Fitr on them, right? Similarly, ومن أسلم أو ولد بعد طلوع الفجر لم تجب فطرته. A person accepts Islam or they come into this world after Fajr, after the time of Fajr starts. There won't be Sadaqah Fitr on them either. Because at the time of wujub, at the time of obligation, there weren't either they weren't Muslim or they weren't in this world. So at that time of obligation, they weren't present as entities on who have to pay fitrah or on their behalf fitrah has to be paid, right? So there won't be anything going on there. So that's when fitr becomes wajib. What is the best time? المستحب أن يخرج الناس الفطر يوم الفطر قبل الخروج إلى المصلى. The best time is that you give your sadaqat al-fitr before you go to eat, right? So it's recommended for people to pay out fitrah on the day of fitr before proceeding to the place of Eid prayers, the Eid ground or the masjid. فإن قدموها قبل يوم الفطر, if someone chooses to pay it advance before the day of fitr within Ramadan, that is also valid. وإن أخروها عن يوم الفطر, but if someone delays it so much that, the whole day goes by, the first day of Eid just goes away. لم تسقط. The obligation still stays, right? Delaying Sadaqah al-Fitr, not a good thing to do. Uh, but the obligation is going to remain. وَكَانَ عَلَيْهِمْ إِخْرَاجُهَا, and it will be the responsibility of that person to actually pay, even if it's on a later date. Right? And this is بخلاف الأضحية, أي Sadaqah al-Fitr remains an obligation even if you delay it. But the same is not the case with sacrificing an animal in Eid al-Adha, because for that, those 3 days are fixed. Like you can't go beyond them.